Sophia woke up early in the morning. The room was still lost in silence, untouched by the sunlight. The old alarm clock, with each tick, left the night behind, and for a moment Sophia thought time had stopped. The beginning of the day always gave her the same sense of peace, but that morning the unease inside her felt a little more pronounced. She slowly pulled her hand from the pillow and decided to leave the cold room. Her feet tensed for a moment as they touched the soft carpet, but then they relaxed. As she left the room, she noticed the shadows by the window dancing joyfully in the morning light. She gently opened the window, and the cold air hit her face, waking her up. The dark sky was slowly beginning to brighten. Everything was quiet, just like her mind. There was an uncertain feeling inside her that something was about to begin, but she couldn't quite tell what it was. As she stepped toward the kitchen, one thing was on her mind. Today was an important day. Today was the day a child would stand trial for theft. Suddenly, the echoes of how that case would affect her life became clear in her mind. She would have to determine that child's fate, possibly changing their life forever. Sophia, thinking about the case, pressed the button on the coffee machine. As the sound quickly rose, the atmosphere in the kitchen began to wake up a little. The caffeine gave her a slight sense of revival. As the coffee brewed, thoughts spun rapidly in her head. The court had always made her feel complicated emotions, especially when it came to juvenile crimes. She had spent years defending children, advocating for them to be given a second chance, but now she was involved in a theft case. This case didn't just feel like a battle for justice. It also reminded her of the dark memories of her past. Her mind was filled with thoughts of the things she had lost in the past. But this case made the burden on her even heavier. As she poured the coffee into her cup, she took the warm drink with her trembling hands and sat by the window. The noise of the city around her seemed so distant in the early morning, but at that moment she was focused only on the unease within her. Outside, life continued, but she was concerned only with this case. Her eyes drifted off. This case, which had started a few weeks ago, was not just about determining whether someone was guilty. It was going to be a confrontation with her past. It was about the intersection of a child's crime and a mother's lost emotional bonds. Sophia began to create an awareness deep within her subconscious. Today something might need to change, but what needed to change wasn't clear yet. An hour later, her eyes were still tired, but she had gathered herself. As she dressed, she looked in the mirror. She put on her black jacket, neatly adjusted her white blouse and skirt, and put on her glasses. The face of this strong woman preparing to leave still looked a little tired in the early morning hours, but the determination in her steps was clear above all else. As she prepared to leave for the courtroom, she took a deep breath for a moment and closed her eyes. Then she made her final preparations for the important trial. Step by step, with each passing second, the feeling inside her intensified. Today, everything could change, but would she fully understand it? Sophia sat down at her desk and flipped through her file, but her eyes suddenly drifted off. Suddenly, the face of the child she had lost years ago appeared before her eyes. That little face still looked at her in the nightmares that woke her up every night. Once her own son had disappeared, but she had never found a trace. Since that day, every moment, every detail had been overwhelmed by the memory of that lost child. She tightly shut her eyes and took a deep breath. She shouldn't be thinking about this. There was an important case in the courtroom. But in that moment, everything seemed connected in some way. The strange look in the child's eyes reminded her of her lost son. Is he guilty? She asked herself. But there was another voice echoing in the emptiness inside her, asking, could he really be guilty? Slowly getting up and looking outside from the window, she realized how much she had fought not to remember her lost son. The day he disappeared, everything had turned dark. After her son went missing, her world had gone silent. Everyone told her she had to be brave. But how could she find the courage to face that silence, that emptiness? Any mother wouldn't want to believe her child was missing. But Sophia knew how she had lived with that reality, how she had slowly absorbed the pain. The days when she waited with a new hope for her lost child were now behind her. But today there was another child in front of her, and in his gaze there was a piece of her lost son. "Are you my mom?" he had said, and something shifted inside Sophia. Everything suddenly became blurry. On one side, her professional identity, on the other, her lost son. Everything was mixing together. For a while she silently sank into her thoughts, but the tense atmosphere in the courtroom reminded her again she had to fulfill her duty as a judge. But this case was different from the others. Was the child guilty, or had there been a mistake? Sophia slowly took the file back into her hands and took a deep breath. Everyone was watching her. She took a deep breath and placed her file on the desk. Setting aside the complex emotions building up inside her, she got up to take her place as judge again. The trial had to begin. However, the arrival of the young boy walking toward the courtroom with heavy steps reminded her of how quickly everything could change. That child was still a teenager, but the crime he had committed had left a huge storm behind. The lost expression on his face had momentarily replaced her lost son. His eyes were like an echo coming from the depths of the past. Sophia closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. As the child made his defense, there was a faint fear and a sense of helplessness in his voice. Sophia's eyes searched for her lost son in his gaze, but something was different. As the child began to defend himself, he was trying to understand what had happened. "I had to do it. I had no other choice," the young man said, his voice trembling. Sophia froze in place. Her eyes couldn't escape the child's eyes. Could he really be guilty, she wondered? The child was helplessly denying the accusations against him, but he looked so vulnerable. His face carried a deep emptiness, like her lost son's, but at the same time, there was also a sense of guilt. The child lowered his eyes and with a little more courage continued, "I grew up on the streets," he said, trying to suppress the trembling in his voice. "I didn't have a family every day. I had to do something to survive. My mom and dad never came back. We were all looking for something, but there was always a missing piece. I was looking for that missing piece." Sophia felt the weight of his words deeply. The child was carefully choosing his words, but the emptiness and helplessness in his eyes were clear above everything else. The child had never seen a real family, never experienced true love. Perhaps once he had a mother, perhaps he was a child lost by his mother. Could that lost mother be like the one who had lost her son years ago? The longing for a lost family in the child's eyes echoed inside Sophia every second. As a mother who had lost her son, she had once fought to survive. But in his situation, there was no light of hope. The loss of her son had been the breaking point of her life. But now, this child in front of her was a representation of a lost life, a lost love. She felt the emptiness inside her grow with each passing second. "It's not my fault," the child said, once again looking up and trying to meet Sophia's eyes. "I am guilty in everyone's eyes, but no one understands our situation. They accuse us without understanding. We don't know what to do. Sometimes you have to do whatever it takes to survive." Sophia briefly returned to her past. She remembered her lost son's smile, how he tightly held her hands. Before her son disappeared, she had told him everything would be okay. But this child was, in fact, a reflection of her lost son. The past and present had somehow intertwined. The courtroom fell silent. As the child made his defense, Sophia realized that everything was a reflection. There was a connection between her lost son's life and this child's lost life. The day her son disappeared, perhaps this child's life was also lost. This was not just a matter of finding a guilty person. It was a matter of lost love, a lost family, and a lost identity. The child took a deep breath and continued, his voice more tremulous. There was more he wanted to say, but the words kept getting stuck, the words echoing in his mouth. "They always excluded me," he said, his eyes dropping to the floor, "because of my race. They always saw me as different. I grew up in the streets, but the streets never accepted me. They always saw me as guilty because my skin was different." Sophia felt the weight of every word. The child's voice grew more fragile with each passing second, but still, he wanted to speak. "Even when I went to school, I was excluded just because of my skin. But no one understood me, no one gave me a chance. They always called me guilty, but I was just trying to survive. That's why, no matter what, I tried to keep moving forward. But my life became just a battle. I fought." The child's eyes carried such deep pain that Sophia couldn't take her eyes off him. This was not just the defense of a child who committed a crime. This was the inner cry of a child who had fought to survive for years, never given the chance he deserved. The child squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to forget all those memories for a moment. "One day I stole something," he said after a brief silence. "But I didn't really steal. I just had things I needed to hold on to. No one helped me. I had no family, no place to protect me. People always saw me as a criminal. But I just wanted to survive, to defend myself, to somehow keep living." Sophia, hearing what the child said, thought about her lost son. The discrimination and exclusion the child had faced might have been a tragedy that mirrored her own son's life. Once her lost son had also been pushed to the edges of society, treated like a nobody. Her son's lost identity now merged with the identity of this child. The child, unable to endure any longer, looked up and stared at Sophia. "I'm not guilty, but no one understands me. Everyone tells me you're always guilty, but I just want to live. For once, to really live like a human." Sophia, with tears in her eyes, looked at the child. In his gaze, she saw a piece of her lost son. Growing up on the streets, racism and exclusion, how similar it was to the world her lost son had lived in. The struggle to survive, the pain of the streets, echoed in every word of this child. Sophia sighed deeply. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she didn't know what to do. This case wasn't just about finding a criminal, it was about understanding a lost generation, lost identities. Sophia tried to set aside the blur in her eyes and the deep emotions she felt, focusing entirely on the courtroom. But the traces of her lost son on the child's face deepened with each passing second, testing her sense of justice. Her eyes were fixed on the birthmark on the child's cheek. Time seemed to stop in that moment. Everything faded, leaving only that mark and the memory of her lost son. The mother inside Sophia suddenly took over. The child she had lost years ago, the one she still saw in her dreams, the one she believed she would always find, was now standing before her. But at the same time, her professional identity and sense of justice were calling to her. She was a judge, and she had to decide whether the child in front of her was guilty. But how? How could a mother with that deep instinct, known only to mothers, pass judgment in a situation so clouded? Sophia took a deep breath. All eyes in the courtroom were on her. In that moment, as she looked at this child who had replaced the son she had lost, questioning whether he was guilty, opened a void within her. Every word, every movement felt like echoes of a dark past. As the child continued his defense, the fear and helplessness in his voice deeply affected Sophia's heart. In that moment, she wasn't watching the defense of a guilty child. She was witnessing the return of a lost life. "I had to do it. I had no other choice," as the child said, his voice trembling. His eyes reflected the fear and guilt inside him, but there was also, perhaps, a hope of being understood. Sophia focused intently on every word. On one side was her professional identity. On the other was the memory of her lost son. She wondered if everything might be a misunderstanding, a misconception. But when she saw the birthmark in his eyes, the anxiety in her heart turned to inner pain. In those eyes, She saw the emotions of her lost son, the confusion of the child who had disappeared years ago. Was this child guilty? Could he really be guilty? Or was there something else, a mistake, a misunderstanding? In that moment, she tried to connect the lost son and the child before her. Perhaps both carried the same pain. You! Sophia, taking a deep breath, her eyes wandered over the child's face, tracing the path of her lost son's mark. My son's birthmark. The child, with a look of fear and uncertainty in his eyes, asked, "What are you saying? What do you mean?" Sophia tried to control the emotions rising within her as a mother. Suddenly, the face of her lost son appeared before her eyes again. When her son disappeared, Sophia was not just a mother who had lost a child. She had also lost a future, a hope every day. But now something was changing. You might be my son," she said, the words slowly falling from her lips. "Michael, you have my lost son's birthmark on your body." The child's eyes widened in confusion. Sophia couldn't take her eyes off him anymore. The chaos inside her deepened. When a mother thinks of her lost child, she carries that emptiness, that pain, in her heart forever. But now, the mark in his eyes was telling her something. Was this child just a memory of her lost son? Or was this the return of a lost future, a lost life? Sophia had no choice but to set aside her professional identity. In that moment, the question was no longer whether the child was guilty, but whether her lost son had returned. As the child looked at her with those mixed emotions, the pain, the lost moments, every memory she'd buried for years came to the surface. "My son," she whispered inside. "Did you come back?" Everything was suddenly so confusing. Judge Sophia, did she want to bring justice in this case? Or was she, as a mother, willing to risk everything to find her lost child? The emotional turmoil within Sophia was starting to draw the attention of everyone in the courtroom. In that moment, it wasn't the objectivity of a judge they were witnessing, but the inner battle of a mother who had lost her child. Everyone felt the tense silence in the courtroom. The child, still confused, tried to understand the familiar expression that had appeared in Sophia's eyes. In that moment, as he battled guilt and regret, the wounds of the past began to reopen. Sophia, placing her hands on the table, slowly took a deep breath. She tried to control the turmoil in her eyes, but with every passing second, the child's gaze, which seemed to replace her lost son, only intensified the emotional storm inside her. I can't do this," she said softly, "but I must do everything that justice requires." The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavy. In her mind, on one side, was the memory of her lost son. On the other, the boundaries of justice were being questioned. As everyone's eyes turned toward her, Sophia's voice echoed in the room. Could this child really be guilty? She thought to herself. But what if it's a misunderstanding? What if my lost son is coming back? The child's face had changed, carrying such a confused expression that Sophia paused for a moment. This case was no ordinary case. This was a battle for a mother to find her lost child. As she questioned the child's innocence, the hope, love, and pain of her long-lost son had been rekindled. At this point, the curiosity and tension among the viewers increased. In a situation where even a judge struggled this much, the greatest pull for the audience was the uncertainty and emotional intensity. Sophia, looking into the child's eyes, noticed the internal conflict. This case was offering her not only the question of guilt, but the hope to find a lost life. Now there was uncertainty about what she would do. "You're not guilty, are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Sophia fell into a moment of deep silence. In that instant, she felt the attention of the entire room on her. This was not just a defense of a criminal, but an effort of a child trying to find a lost future. This moment passed through every emotional layer in a way that would draw the audience and listeners in. The case, where both the story of a guilty and an innocent child intertwined, left questions and an emotional echo for every viewer. The moment Sophia had to decide was not only a great decision as a judge, but also as a mother. It would shape the moment that would change her life, echo in the hearts of the audience, and plunge the entire room into silence. As Sophia listened to the child's defense, she felt everything inside her mixing together in an instant. The child's eyes resembled those of her lost son, but at the same time, they were so different. The child was just as helpless as she was. Every word, every defense, pulled her into the labyrinths of the past, making her question whether this child was truly guilty. Every sentence spoken by the child during their defense deepened the emptiness inside Sophia. "I grew up on the streets," he said. "No one helped me. Most of the time I couldn't find food. Most of the time I slept on the streets, but I just wanted to survive." These words deeply shook Sophia's heart. This child had fought to survive, struggled just to breathe. But the saddest part was that society had always branded him as guilty. In that moment, Sophia felt the pain the child was going through inside herself. She thought that maybe her lost son could have been living just like this, alone on the streets, trying to survive without help, and doing whatever it took just to live, without being guilty. Sophia's eyes blurred as she looked at the child's face. Slowly, she noticed the deep emptiness and fear in his eyes. The helplessness in his eyes reminded her exactly of the emptiness her lost son once carried. She could see the traces of the lost years in his eyes, the years that her son had been missing. In his eyes, there was no guilt, only the struggle to survive. Sophia's heart tightened as she examined the child more closely, not knowing what to do with the feelings inside her. The child lowered his eyes, and there was intense regret on his face. Although Sophia wanted to act immediately, she took a deep breath and paused. "Are you still guilty?" she asked. But this question was not just a question, it was a dilemma, because in that moment the question, "Are you guilty?" felt as if it was asked not only to the child, but also to her lost son. Sophia tried to maintain her professional identity, but setting aside every emotion, every memory inside her, was becoming harder with each passing minute. Since the day her son went missing, she had seen every decision, every move, as a result of this moment. Seeing the pain her lost son had gone through, in the pain this child was going through, made everything seem so alike, complicating her mind even more. The child's face began to resemble the face of her lost son more and more. Even though she was looking at a different child, the emotions inside her were pulling her into her past. Sophia slowly bent down and approached the child. "Listen to me," she said, her voice trembling. "Could you really be guilty? Was this really what you had to do?" The child looked at Sophia with emptiness and fear in his eyes. "I don't know," he said. "But so many people turned their backs on me in my life. So many people didn't care about me. I did things. But was this a crime? Maybe I was just trying to survive. But every time I did something, a piece of me got lost. In the end, everything exploded." Sophia felt the lost years of her son and the poverty and helplessness her lost child had lived in with every word the child spoke. Slowly, she began to carefully look at the child's birthmark. Since the day her son went missing, she had never noticed this mark, but now, in that mark, she was finding the lost years, the lost child. For a moment her mind became clouded. She felt as though she had found her lost son in the child's eyes. For a moment, this child felt like her lost son. And this child seemed to bring a new meaning to her life, replacing her son who had been lost for years. But Sophia couldn't allow that. She was a judge. There was no room for emotions. But in that moment, everything became mixed together. Sophia began to form a connection between the child, illuminated by the light, and the memory of her lost child in the dark. Her heart was racing, but she was silently trying to accept this truth. Was it the lost years of her son, or was it this child's fight for survival that was right. When Sophia made eye contact with the child, her heart stopped for a moment. Her eyes locked onto the child, whose eyes carried all the pain of her lost son and the traces of lost time. At that moment, the pain of the past hit her again. Suddenly, old nightmares resurfaced in her mind, the terrifying days when her son had gone missing. Her son had once disappeared from her eyes. Now, in front of her, this child seemed to carry the soul of the son she had lost for a lifetime. Everything became blurred in an instant. As a mother, she wanted to help him, to end his pain. But as a judge, she had to uphold justice. She was stuck between two different worlds. Since the day her son went missing, justice had been a part of her life. But now, did justice have room for her as a mother? This battle was making her face the greatest struggle. The child's defense deeply affected Sophia. "I had to do this," he said. But when Sophia heard this, she felt like everything had lost its meaning. When her son went missing, there was the same helplessness, the same sense of necessity. Could he really be guilty, she asked herself, but at the same time she knew that a mother shouldn't show mercy to a criminal. That was the ruthless side of justice. Something stirred within Sophia. Yes, this child had suffered, but letting his crime go unpunished would undermine society's sense of justice. The courtroom was silent. This silence only intensified the noise inside Sophia. Everyone's eyes were on her. She was the symbol of justice as a judge. This was her duty, but she was also a woman, a mother. Everything was personal, but nothing should be personal in a courtroom. Losing her son did not give her the right to show mercy to a criminal. The loss of her son had taught her both how to be a mother and how to deliver justice. But now, she was standing at the fine line between the two with this child in front of her. Sophia tightly closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Young man, your past may have shaped you," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "But that doesn't excuse the crimes you've committed. You need to understand that." Her words were in conflict with both her motherly instincts and her responsibility as a judge. But when her voice trailed off, the echo of her words made the atmosphere in the courtroom even heavier. This case isn't about your story. It's about the protection of society. In the face of the law and justice, nothing can be above that. The child's face paled. He was so young, but his face carried the traces of years, fear, hopelessness, and vulnerability, all in one. His eyes suddenly reflected the pain of the past and perhaps even the spirit of Sophia's lost son. There was a pressure on everyone, but Sophia's decision was clear. She believed that justice had to be applied correctly, even though her heart ached while making that decision. "I sentence you," Sophia said, her voice trembling and slow, but every word was stronger than the broken emotions in a mother's heart. As a judge, she was fulfilling her duty, but her motherly feelings were causing her more pain. But if there is something that defends you, something that can help you, it's that you will return to society and learn from your mistakes. Every word opened a wound inside Sophia. The child's eyes had filled with tears, but something had changed. As she made the decision, everything seemed to slow down in that moment. Sophia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The pain she felt while making her decision was the duty to do what was right, no matter what. Since the day her son went missing, she had always known that things would turn out this way. But as a mother, giving her son a punishment was a mother's worst nightmare. Today, that nightmare stood vividly in front of her. When Sophia closed her eyes, her mind immediately went back to the day her son had disappeared. No matter how much she wanted to, she had to accept that justice in this world had a cost. There was a pain that had accumulated over the years in her eyes, but as a judge, she had to bear this burden. The guilty one, no matter what, had to face their punishment. Sophia's decision had been made. Even if she found her lost son years later, she had to deliver his punishment with her own hands. This was the painful burden of both justice and motherhood. This decision was a moment that would change a mother's life, but also shape the future of society.